So one or two people have World War I posters, and the context of World War I leads into World War II and sets up a lot of different elements and is moving towards establishing the United States as a world power. But the thing is, right, with World War I and the context of it, my subtitle here, to be or not to be a world power, the United States hadn't decided, right? The U.S. is very isolationist. And, I mean, there's even moments now, right? The United States is very isolationist. Things are happening. What, motivates U.S. involvement or United States to care about other things, right? It's just, sometimes we do, sometimes we don't, but isolationism is big in U.S. history. So what does that mean, right? So coming out of the Civil War, the United States had worked really hard at rebuilding. It was, it had become economically stable. It was doing pretty well. I guess it could be as fully recovered from the Civil War as we could maybe call it, given that there's still some states today that are not recovered from the Civil War. They never made it back economically from that. So the U.S. was as whole as it was going to be from the Civil War at that moment, and it was just sort of interested in itself. It was not looking necessarily to be a world power, and World War I brought that moment, that sort of decision, do you want to get involved or do you not want to get involved, in these other issues. So, who was involved in World War I? First of all, we have the two groupings, and so first there's the Central Powers. So Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria, they made up the Central Powers, and then connected to that was a Triple Alliance, which was a standing alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. But in terms of World War I, Italy was maintaining neutrality. Then on the other side, you had the Triple Entente, which was the United Kingdom, Russia, and France. A little bit into World War I, Italy decided it was not going to stay neutral, and it switched sides. So it abandoned, its role in the alliance. And then in 1915, Japan decided to join the Triple Entente. So these were the main players in that group. So it went from 3 to 5. And then the associated powers, eventually the United States, Belgium, Serbia, Greece, Montenegro, and Romania. So how did this whole thing start? So Austria-Hungary's Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, right, and so their issues with Serbia in that assassination of one of their, big figureheads. And, Germany was, as an ally of Austria-Hungary, they were compelled to support Austria-Hungary in wanting to go to war, except a strange thing happened. So Germany mobilizes, World War I starts, but Germany heads through Belgium and straight for France. Germany's not all that interested in Serbia and Austria-Hungary's issue with what actually started World War I. Germany wants to be seen as at least an equal, if not greater, power than the United Kingdom, Russia, and France. It's really jaded in some ways as a country towards those other three, United Kingdom, Russia, and France, and the sort of global powers that they are. And so it wants to sort of destroy that, and it heads through Belgium as quickly as possible so that it can hit France before France has time to prepare. And, right, the goal is to take over France and then conquer the world. So not just World War II, right? World War I. So they made their move, and so within 2 days, and so in order to avoid Russian troops forming and coming down to stop them, Germany violated the unofficial rules of warfare. There was no, NATO, there wasn't even League of Nations yet, so no Geneva Convention when you think about, rules of warfare. So they just sort of slaughtered everyone in their path, right? They just go through towns, just civilians, because they needed to get through Belgium as quickly as possible. and attack France before Russia got there. And so that was a move that was really hard for some Americans to stomach, and sort of sit back and not get involved. But the United States official position was to not join the war. Why was that the position? Woodrow Wilson was president. He was pro-diplomacy, which led to U.S. neutrality. And Wilson, he didn't want to get involved in war, right? He didn't think that that was a productive use of time, and so he resisted it. That, and paired with like isolationism, there wasn't necessarily those motivators for U.S. citizens. Majority, I mean, you had some very, very strong anti-war activists, right? A lot of women, and this desire to protect our sons, don't send them off to a foreign war, right? Those ideas of this doesn't pertain to us, was very strong. And then the U.S. was making money, a lot of money on the war, because they were manufacturing weapons and shipping them to Britain, France, right? Like that, the Triple Entente powers. And that was sort of enough for Woodrow Wilson at the time. But the big thing, so jumping down to the news censorship. So in claiming neutrality, Woodrow Wilson demanded that the news media not present any favor one way or the other, on the war and like in presenting the information that they had. I mean, despite the fact that the United States is supplying one side with, weapons, it's very clear like where the U.S.'s sort of allegiance is. But that news censorship was a big deal. And, one issue was like Britain had cut the transatlantic cable lines, so the only news that was coming in was from Britain. And so that made like German newspapers in the United States very upset that there was like, they didn't have access to other sides of the story, right? Richard Harding Davis, he was both, like fiction writer, like he wrote books and stuff, and, pretty well-known journalist. And he went like immediately, to Belgium and France and documented what was happening there and like his first-hand accounts. And he immediately decided he could not stay neutral, that people had to understand what was happening and that like the inhumaneness of it and the idea of sort of like what would later become like war crimes that Germany was sort of engaged in. So he sent all his articles back and a lot of them were censored. And so he ended up publishing all of those stories as the like introduction to one of his books. And it sold like crazy, which then motivated 100,000 U.S. men of the elite. So this means like US, they had to have means. They had to have money in order to buy passage to Europe. And they joined up with one of the other armies. A lot joined in France, right? Since the U.S. wasn't engaging in the war, these U.S. citizens were just like, no, we can't sit by when we know this is what's happening over there. And they just chose to join the war, with another country. Or as sort of like representing another country. And that was like a big sort of move. But again, they had to have money in order to do that. It was a lot of people dropped out of college. You had college professors, right? Like, it's people with the means who went over and, joined the war without the U.S. It wasn't the last. It like actually was not enough to make the U.S. join the war, but it was another big moment in the war, and probably the most well-known thing about World War I for most people was the sinking of the Lusitania. And so Lusitania was a passenger ship, sort of like a cruise ship-ish, not quite to the same extent, but for moving civilians back and forth across the Atlantic. And it was attacked and sunk by German submarines. and it had United States civilians. I want to say it was like maybe 130, I think was the number, that were like U.S. citizens. But there were a lot more people from other places as well on the ship. And so it was like this big sort of international incident. And Germany, the thing that kept that from being the thing that entered the U.S. into the war was that Germany claimed that they only sunk the ship because it was transporting weapons, bombs and whatnot, over to Britain. And so it technically was not a civilian ship if it was shipping military supplies. And it was, in fact, shipping military supplies, like, provided by the United States, right, in our big money-making off of World War I. And so they had some sort of conversation about it, and it's like, okay, don't do it again. But that still wasn't enough to really push the United States into the war. It took much longer, and, right, like, the thing that initially came out of World War I was League of Nations, even though it fell apart and was later replaced by NATO. But Woodrow Wilson, right, he was very, like, religious and didn't see that, like, physical violence as the answer. So he really did spend a lot of time trying to go about other means of addressing what was happening in Europe with World War I before the U.S. finally joined.